Thanks, Denny. Glad to have the opportunity to share one of the research reports and updates from our universities. I'm going to share a little bit of Zach Rambo's PhD research. Zach's sitting up here in the front, so as we get really technical questions you got over lunch hour, feel free to corner Zach and ask him those kind of things. As all good PhD students should do, they should stretch your program and your professor, and he's definitely doing that with some of the things we did. I want to share just a couple of details with a couple of projects. When Ractopamine got approved 12, 13 years ago, Dr. Schinkel and I did a lot of research related to this and step-up programs and use programs, the amino acid requirements, as many people did. And so this fit really well with some of the interests we've had in the last decade. Zinc is really important nutritionally as a trace mineral. Confers over 300 proteins functionality, especially in DNA and RNA replication. And so when we turn up this machinery with ractopamine feeding, it made some sense. We need to reconsider what that requirement or what that need is for some of these trace minerals in that ractopamine feeding period. There's definitely some data on the deficiency side that shows that there's an important function in the immune function side with zinc. And as we already know with ractopamine, we see a nice improvement in average daily gain and efficiency. And as our feed costs have gone up and there's short corn supply, ingredient supplies, that feed efficiency is becoming really important in the next year. Just a little more background about the zinc side. We know we use it a lot in the pharmacological doses in nursery pigs, but on the nursery side, it does not really always translate to what we want to look at in the grow finish side. And specifically in the grow finish with ractopamine-fed pigs, we've not gone back and looked at any of the trace mineral requirements for those pigs. When we turn up that machinery, we get another 35% increase in lean accretion rates. What's that change? The requirements of vitamins, minerals, all those things. Very little's done. Well, there was some work done with ractopamine and Avela zinc in cattle. They saw an increase in final live weights, hot carcass weights, and gain, ribeye areas as well. And then in 2011, Dr. Patience presented an abstract at Midwest Animal Science meetings where he showed a response of Avela zinc to increase efficiency and numerically improve the average daily gain above zinc sulfate. So we wanted to follow that up with one study looking at utilizing zinc oxide instead of zinc sulfate as the trace mineral source for our zinc. We looked at it over a couple of different periods. In this study, we preloaded the pigs with either additional Avela zinc or zinc oxide above NRC. So NRC was our base. We supplemented on top of that. So we added an additional 50 parts per million to the 50 that was already there from the trace mineral premix. We fed ractopamine then for 21 days at the end of the grow finish study and broke out the treatments a little bit differently. So to kind of explain the treatments in this first study, we had pigs fed 50 parts per million zinc oxide or 50 parts per million from Avela zinc source, an amino acid chelated zinc source from Zinpro. And then we broke that out after that first finisher period where we looked at thinking we might have to fill those tissues, quote unquote, before we started that ractopamine feeding. We had a low lysine control, still fed additional 50 parts per million zinc oxide. The high lysine diet that was fed to the ractopamine-fed pigs with the two different zinc sources at 50 parts per million zinc oxide or Avela zinc, and then a 7.5 parts per million ractopamine for those last 21 days. So a very common ractopamine feeding program, that's 675 grams per ton or 7.5 part per million for 21 days. We did a lot of detailed carcass work, ultrasounds looking at lean accretion rates. We did some detailed work at the meats lab where we dissected out the carcasses from the ham side to look at actual lean and fat composition in those hams, as well as we did some work at the abattoir with packing industry. We did a statistical analysis and we used single differium contrast to separate out that lysine effect. We wanted to prove that it wasn't just the high lysine diets being fed, and actually I'll show you that it's interesting what happens with pigs fed excess lysine relative to the ractopamine effect, comparing source effects of zinc and then that interaction. Fairly similar finisher 1 diets, preloading before we started feeding ractopamine, 0.8 lysine for a couple weeks, 0.75 TID lysine, corn, soy, and 15% distillers. Not the highest distillers we'd feed, but some distillers included in those diets. The finish or two during the ractopamine feeding, we backed that distillers down to 5%, trying to keep our pork quality in a good condition. 4% swine grease added to all those diets. And during that last finisher phase, we have that low lysine control at 0.7 TID and a 1.0 TID for the ractopamine fed pigs. So performance data, the pre-period, 35 days prior to feeding ractopamine, neither zinc source improved performance or changed performance. They're identical. So supplementing an additional 50 parts per million did not change gain, or feed intake or efficiency during that period. But then we break out into the ractopamine feeding period, and the red bar is our control pigs fed that low lysine diet. The higher lysine diets fed to supplemental zinc oxide or Avela-Zinc is the next blue and green bar. The last darker blue and green bars are then those zinc oxide and Avela-Zinc fed with ractopamine. And as you can see, we got a nice ractopamine response, almost 30% increase in average daily gain when we fed ractopamine. So a beautiful ractopamine response. In addition, we saw an Avela-Zinc response where we bumped gain additional 5 and 8% whether there was ractopamine or not this last phase. Interestingly, when you feed, you always think we got to have that lysine control, right? That we know that it's not a lysine effect and what we're doing. So we fed that low lysine diet, and actually we hurt performance by feeding that elevated lysine diet when there's not ractopamine in that diet by about 8% reduction in average daily gain across those two bars. Feed intake, we see a little bit of that lysine effect where the high lysine diets without ractopamine reduced feed intake, but other than that there's just some trends for some slight changes there. Feed efficiency was impacted when we fed ractopamine. Right? We got a 25% improvement in feed efficiency when we fed ractopamine for these last two bars relative to those that were on the same lysine diet without ractopamine. In addition, the Avela-Zinc bumped up feed efficiency in both situations. So that gain and efficiency followed each other very well in this first study to respond both to ractopamine and to the supplemental Avela-Zinc source. Overall, those trends that we saw in the last 21 days, because there was no effect early, carried through with increased gain due to the ractopamine-fed pigs, as well as we see that tendency now at a 0.06 for the zinc effect to change things as well. Feed efficiency is improved, and this is, for that last half of grow finish, 56 days, we get a nice change by feeding that ractopamine just those 21 days. So overall barn feed efficiency is substantial. Hog carcass weights, as you'd expect, because of gains going up, we have more carcass to sell. And so we have that response with ractopamine and Avela-Zinc, both being sterilized step-ups. And so we can look at approximately 3 to 5 kilos more of hog carcass weight to sell with that ractopamine-fed pigs and the enhancement with the zinc source, the Avela-Zinc. So for a small increase in cost, about 12 cents a pig for that Avela-Zinc source, we can add somewhere around 3 kilos more carcass weight in this study. Loin muscle areas increased with ractopamine as you'd expect. Very nice step up increase of about 10% in loin muscle area. In looking at more detailed carcass kind of side of things, the ham dissection works really well to predict that lean accretion change that you may see with ractopamine. So we dissected out the right hams of all the pigs that came to campus, and you can see that you have that ractopamine response, increasing that dissected lean weight in those hams. Part of that is related to the heavier carcasses, right? When you have a heavier carcass, you're going to have more ham there to dissect. And in the ractopamine-fed pigs, we get a further improvement, like we saw with the gain and carcass weights in that dissected ham lean. To flip it and look at what percent of that ham is actually lean, is looking at what are we getting from a change in fat accretion and muscle accretion, right? And so we see that response that we see with ractopamine with an increase in ham percent lean, decrease concurrently with lipid composition in that ham. Some interesting things with the ractopamine having that same bump in percent lean of that ham going up. So not only pounds, but the percent of that ham being in lean went up when figs were fed ractopamine. We got an odd decrease, we can't explain, with that percent ham lean going down with the Avela-Zinc source in the high lysine diet fed pigs. We've looked at the data. It's one of those things we just can't fully explain at this point. One of the things we did is the opportunity when you bring those animals to campus is you can look at some feet and some other things that may happen with feeding different ingredients, right? And we know that ractopamine has a negative effect on foot health. And so will this zinc, which is known to have some effects on the sow herd side, with improving structure and soundness of those feet and legs in the sow herds, will it have an effect when pigs are fed ractopamine? And so this is kind of a visual of some of the range of feet that we saw in those pigs. Really good, clean feet, no lesions, no cracks, no horn cracks. And it progresses as we go across. You'll start seeing some horn cracks, some pad cracks come across as you look at the front and rear feet of those pigs. Progressively getting a little bit worse. You start getting some pad ulcerations, which start to turn into some wound issues. And you can get some complete cracks that are actually, you can see the red inflammation where they're really trying to fight that area. So you get quite a range in a short period of time of feeding ractopamine and what you'll have with foot issues and potential issues there. And just as summary, what we saw, there was some detrimental effects on foot health with ractopamine feeding with increased total number and overall severity of horn cracks, the pad bruises, and what we call ulcerations, where that tissue is starting to come apart and lose its form. Whoops. The Avela-Zinc tended to reduce the total number and severity of the horn cracks, and it did reduce and tend to reduce the severity and number of foot ulcers that we saw. The ractopamine with the Avela-Zinc combination, total number and severity of horn cracks and ulcers did go down, very close to what we got back to the similar to the negative controls. So it did seem to help with that foot health issue, even in ractopamine-fed pigs, for a short duration of feeding. So in the first experiment, things looked really good, right? We had a nice response in gain. Ractopamine response was there. We got a nice response with Avela-Zinc, seemed to enhance that response. So the question that we were starting to ask ourselves is why? And is it muscle synthesis rates? And are we turning things up? Is zinc involved? We know that in some of the key things that happen there. And so can we look at what's going on with zinc in that situation? So our thought was that maybe zinc acts as multiple steps in the amino acid and insulin signaling pathway. And so specifically looking at the mTOR pathway with these zinc amino acids, increasing the phosphorylation of some of these key regulatory steps. And so that was the design and thought of the next project, okay, was are we going to see some changes relative to looking at the basic biology of what's going on and feeding that additional zinc source. So the next study, which we just finished this spring, Zach looked at source and level. So is it really 50 parts per million? Can we get away with half that dose? And so we looked at a couple of different treatments, looking at just the ractopamine response relative to the zinc source and level, but using a step-up ractopamine program this time. So we're trying to really maximize that ractopamine response a little bit better for 28 days instead of 21 days and carry that out a little further. And so we had a series of 6 treatments here for that 28-day period. So unlike the first experiment, we didn't preload the pigs. We just kept everybody on zinc oxide at 50 parts per million prior to starting the study. Then we went ahead and we had a basal diet with no supplemental zinc, but did have ractopamine. And then 25 parts per million from zinc oxide or Avela-Zinc with ractopamine in the diet, 50 parts per million from the 2 sources with ractopamine. And then this last comparison relative to not having any ractopamine in that diet to get that ractopamine response in the design and the layout. Okay? Very similar to the first experiment from a carcass detail standpoint, as same as we use some single differium contrast to sort things out. So going across the slide, this is the performance during the whole ractopamine period, the full 28 days. This is no supplemental zinc from either source, 25 parts per million from oxide or Avela-Zinc, 50 from oxide and 50 from Avela-Zinc, and then no ractopamine at all. We got a ractopamine response, but it blew up the first experiment, right? We got very little response to gain differentiating between level or zinc source in this study. It didn't follow the pattern of the first experiment, which tends to happen. There's a little bit of difference in feed intake as we look across the feed intakes for this time period. With a slight reduction in feed intake with these higher zinc sources, inclusion rate, especially with the available zinc being slightly less from a feed intake standpoint than the control with no supplemental zinc. But not much there, just a little bit of noise going back and forth. Feed efficiency, pretty identical across the board. A little bit numerical improvement as we get up to the 50 parts per million, but there's nothing there statistically. Just a nice ractopamine differential where those pigs not fed ractopamine, you drop 50 points in feed efficiency. Okay? Final body weights, these pigs were heavier. We went to 300 pounds. Okay? And so we did take them out a lot further, but that ractopamine response of additional 5 kilos of final body weight is pretty consistent. We also didn't have as big of a difference in feet issues. Okay? There was some differences there, but they were small and they were numerical. There was a numerical reduction in foot health and characteristics with the ractopamine feeding, but really no significant effect of supplemental zinc related to those, just a slight tendency to reduce some of those pad cracks in the bottom of those feet. Okay? So, left us scratching our head, right, this summer, trying to figure some things out. Zach's still working on the third experiment because there's very little data out there related to beta agonists and the mTOR pathway, but also where does zinc fit into this system, and where does it trigger things to enhance that response. And so some things that Zach is still working on with the third experiment where we have some individually fed gilts is trying to detail where those things come together, and if we can at least point to that part of the pathway, right, and what's going on. But why the difference in the responses? Well, as we got back to thinking about it, the first experiment, those pigs actually broke with influenza prior to that study starting. And so they had a little more disease health challenge issues. Okay? And so we had more injectable treatment rates. We had 3 pigs that had to be pulled off test, either because they died or they didn't respond to treatment. Whereas the second study, we didn't have a single pig have a problem. Right? Very low injection rates, very little treatment issues. So we're starting to think, is it really this zinc working more on the health function that zinc has? Maybe more so than it is actually the muscle synthesis rate side. And by removing those potential limitations on the health side and the immune stimulation side, we're seeing a better response to the ractopamine in that first experiment. Hypothesis, right? We know that zinc has some health effects that are critical in gene regulation and the lymphocytes side of things, the normal function and division of neutrophils and natural killer cells, antibody production and the IgG side, but also that there can be some damaging done to the linings of both the intestinal tract and the pulmonary system. Well, if you have a respiratory issue, that pulmonary system is going to be pretty involved. Will zinc help with that and healing some of that? In a feeding study with some mice with elevated levels of zinc, they did improve T lymphocyte and macrophage function, and so that might lead us down that path. Well, industry conditions are a little bit different than Purdue University conditions, right? And so there's a large study that just got done looking at a large industry study, not designed how we would typically design things, right? The control pigs, we got 7,600 pigs on the control diets, 7,500 on the Avela-Zinc diets. But hey, those in the back, you can't see this very well. The control is they had their 120 parts per million from zinc sulfate in the diet. And they didn't want to change anything, so we added just Avela-Zinc on top. So you've now got 170 parts per million of zinc in the Avela-Zinc treatment. It's the combination of both the zinc sulfate and the Avela-Zinc on top. So looking at just production data, you got 4 shorter days to market, 2 kilos heavier at that time period. So the gain is higher at 27 grams per day. Feed efficiency is very similar. Higher percentage of pigs that make the grid within this operation. And so if you extrapolate back to looking at not only the differences of 2 more kilos and 4 less days, but if they go to the same time in that barn, it's 5 more kilos of body weight going out the door. And so in that field situation, it may have much better application and implication, but it almost points back towards there might be a bigger health effect than there is a muscle synthesis effect. And we're still trying to sort through some of those issues and what's going on there. So with that, I am 1 minute before lunch, and I try to get done in time, get that quickly. I'll field a question or two, but as I mentioned, Zach is up here, and he can answer questions all lunch hour to help answer those questions. Okay?